So welcome. Again, I'm Lisa Napolitano. I am a clinical psychologist and the founder of CBT, DBT Associates. If you've done any other webinars with us, we specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and dialectical behavior therapy, DBT. And what I'm going to do today, what I would like to do, is walk you through some CBT techniques that we use in treating perfectionism. And they're designed to help people dispense with the problematic aspects of their perfectionism while allowing them to keep the aspects that are working for them. And we won't have time to go over all aspects of CBT for perfectionism this morning, but I wanted to pass along to you some of the key interventions. And I should point out, many of the techniques I'm going to cover today are found in the book Never Good Enough, which I highly recommend, by Monica Bosco Ramirez. It's a self-help book. So if you're a perfectionist, you know firsthand, it's a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. Having very high standards can optimize our performance in work, in our personal lives. But it can also fuel a sense of chronic dissatisfaction and a sense we're never good enough. And I often see it's a contributing factor to writer's block for many people and procrastination. So, for example, in the quest to write the perfect essay, we sit for hours in front of a blank screen, having written absolutely nothing. Or we think if I can't get it done perfectly, I won't do it at all. And as a result, things just don't get done. Perfectionism is also implicated in a variety of psychological disorders, including OCD, body dysmorphic disorder, depression, and anxiety. So while it's not inherently problematic, it can be. So as I go through the material today, think about how perfectionism is hindering you personally or professionally. And if you're tuning in as a mental health professional, how this is playing out for your clients. All right. So the first point I want to make about perfectionism or perfection is, and this is the big problem with it, it's often a moving target. So we tell ourselves we'll know it when we see it or when we reach it. But really, once we've moved beyond a multiple choice test in an academic context, what constitutes perfection is subjective, right? So for example, what would be a perfect admissions essay, right? What are the criteria we would use to evaluate that? And the other big problem with perfection is it reflects a black and white thinking style. This is a big focus in CBT. If you practice CBT or you're in it, you know that. So for example, either I'm the best or I've failed. The best or the worst. I win or I lose. And as a result of black and white thinking, there are no shades of gray. There are no degrees of success or degrees of excellence. Now, sometimes things truly are black and white, but often it's not the case, right? Reality often lies in the shades of gray. So one of the overarching objectives in working with people, including yourself if you're struggling with it, in treating perfection is cultivating a more nuanced thinking style rather than this categorical thinking style. And working towards the idea performance can still be excellent, even if it's not the best, right? Another benefit of a more nuanced thinking style is we're better positioned to realistically evaluate our performance and the performance of others. So if we think of, for example, 360 reviews, right, that you may have received or given, at work, you know someone can be excellent overall and still have areas for development as well as their areas of strength. Right? So black and white thinking and moving target. So the first technique I want to talk about is explicitly defining what constitutes perfection, right? So what we're going to do is delineate the criteria so you'll know you've reached it or you haven't. So I wanted to walk through, I'm going to share the screen. Let's see if I can get this up for you. I drew a continuum while I'm looking for it, and I can't find it. So you would draw a line segment, and at one end we have 100%, and at the other end 0. All right. So let's work with the example of a perfect essay. So we're going to operationalize what constitutes perfection for the essay. And again, this is subjective. So someone might say, well, certainly no typos at a bare minimum, right? No grammatical errors. It's concise. It's well organized. It highlights relevant experience. It shows how I'm a good fit for the program. And it's original, right? So I have those criteria. Then I want to define 0% on my scale, which would be the converse, right? So it's rife with misspellings or typos, grammatical errors. It's verbose rather than concise. There's no organization to it. It's trite, it's not original, doesn't talk about relevant experience, doesn't express any interest, and it's a good fit. So it's the polar opposite. The challenge, and again, what will help cultivate a more nuanced thinking style is defining the midpoints, the points along the continuum, right? So if you're visualizing a line segment in the middle, what does 50% look like, right? So I'll often ask clients, well, wait a minute, what about someone who's got a really engaging, interesting essay, and there are a couple of typos, one grammatical error. They highlight their experience, but they don't explicitly state, this is my first choice. Where would you put them on the continuum? And this can be challenging, right? Because it's not clearly one end or the other. Then you would, if you get the idea, define what constitutes 75%. And then, if you've written your essay, where would you place your essay on the continuum? So the beauty of this technique is it provides a roadmap for improving your performance, right? So if I, after evaluating using these criteria, decide my essay is really not at 0 or 50 as I may have been thinking, right? Perfectionists tend to be hypercritical. It's actually 75. I know what I need to do to improve it and get it to 100 because the criteria are spelled out, right? I could use this technique before I even start writing my essay, which would be very helpful to me in moving me along and kind of decrease the likelihood I get derailed by perfectionism. So if I haven't started yet, I could ask myself, where do I need to be on this continuum? Now, this is a question perfectionists typically don't ask, right? Because they tend to apply perfectionism across the board rather than selectively. It's kind of like autopilot application. So for example, if I'm emailing my team back at work or my boss, does my work need to be perfect in this context? Right? So we're looking at perfection, what constitutes it in particular contexts, chipping away at this kind of global diffuse thinking style. Does the dishwasher need to be loaded perfectly? You know, we can laugh at that, but I've watched people load and unload the dishwasher multiple times. And to me, it seems like a colossal waste of time, right? Does the laundry need to be done perfectly? If everything's done perfectly, it's exhausting. So the continuum technique can also help us to channel perfection more selectively rather than apply it across the board on autopilot. Right. So continuum technique we can use, I'm using it with clients for school assignments, reports, parenting. I have clients who believe they're bad parents because they're not the perfect parent. And they haven't even begun to consider, what does that mean when I say perfect parent? What does that really mean? What would that even look like? And usually the criteria when we spell them out are very unrealistic. Never get angry with your child. Never get frustrated, right? So it's actually, I mean, I know conceptually, it's a very simple technique, but it has a big impact. It really forces us to confront, what are we really saying to ourselves, right? What am I really shooting for? So to summarize, and if anyone has any questions about this technique, just jump in. We're defining first what constitutes perfection, right? So it's no longer a moving target, and we're accurately evaluating our performance, right? And we have a roadmap to improve it. The continuum technique also promotes a more gray, shades of gray thinking style. It kind of chips away at this black and white thinking that is so characteristic of people who tend to be perfectionistic, and makes it clear that there can be degrees of success rather than just two categories of success and failure. A related problem that I find in working with perfectionists is they tend to lose the forest for the trees. In other words, in the quest to do something perfectly, the objective or the purpose of the task is lost, right? So I mentioned the dishwasher earlier, right? Is it really about doing it perfectly or just getting the dishes in there? So, for example, I was working with someone who had been placed on probation at work because she was inordinately slow in getting back to her superiors. And she would spend hours, and this was really painful for her emotionally, editing basic emails to clients. Really got hijacked by perfectionism and lost. And we spent time refocusing on the purpose. What is the objective, right, in sending this email? What am I trying to do? Is it to convey information? Is it to connect with the other person? For many perfectionists, they believe it's better not to do something at all rather than to do it imperfectly, right? And that's when perfectionism is no longer enhancing performance, it's become maladapted. In actuality, we know there are very few situations in life, work, academia, where it's true that it's just better not to do something if you're not going to do it perfectly. It's usually better to get it done than not to do anything. So to decrease the likelihood we're going to get bogged down in perfectionism, we need to bring into our awareness the objective of my task. And I recommend often writing it down. And again, it's going to sound familiar. Bullets, criteria. What are my objectives? Write them down. And then once I've hit them, I'm out. Okay. So the purpose of a cover letter, I've worked with people with writer's block. They're trying to write a perfect cover letter for a job. And they've lost sight of the function of the cover letter. It's to express interest in the position. It could be other things, but I'm just going to go with these. Show that you're qualified or a good fit, highlight experience, and then thank the reader. So 3 or 4 things, not overcomplicating it. So I think it's really important to define our objectives ahead of time to decrease the likelihood we're going to get derailed by useless perfectionism. I'm just thinking, I had a client who in CBT, we use a lot of worksheets in CBT if you're not in it or doing it yourself, who actually reformatted all my worksheets before completing them, right? So think of all the extra time, and he just reflexively went with that instinct. to do it, right? So if there are no questions, I want to shift gears a little and talk about core beliefs. So what are core beliefs? So core beliefs are an important focus of cognitive behavioral therapy. These are long-standing beliefs that we form about ourselves or the world or other people. Typically at a younger age. I think adolescence is a very ripe period for the development of negative core beliefs. So our process is biased in that we're focusing basically on negative core beliefs, the ones that are causing distress and problems in emotional and behavioral functioning. We can think of them as lenses on a pair of glasses we use to view the world, right? So they color our perceptions, what we see, and as I've said, affect us emotionally and behaviorally. So just to back up a little, there are multiple levels of cognition we focus on in CBT. I didn't want to get too detailed. We have automatic thoughts that just pop into your head without deliberate thinking. And that's typically where we start in CBT. We have people write down what was going through their mind in a certain situation when they got upset. And that's a skill to be able to identify those thoughts. And a core tenet of CBT is that our thoughts are not always facts, right? I mean, sometimes they are, but they're propositions to be examined, okay? So for example, I'm a woman, that's a fact, I'm a psychologist, but I could have the thought, I'm a failure. And that might be a little bit more up for grabs. We'd want to kind of understand, why do I say that? So CBT entails evaluating thoughts. And the core beliefs are a deeper level of cognition, but they're not subconscious, right? So unlike psychodynamic therapy, they can be accessed. So CBT, we're teaching clients how to identify our core beliefs, right? And then if we'd like to change them, how to weaken them. And there are many different ways to do that. So for example, in depression, it's not uncommon for someone who's depressed to have the belief, I'm a failure, right? And they may maintain this belief despite considerable evidence to the contrary, which is really interesting. How have they, you might wonder, maintained this belief over the course of their lives, despite all this evidence to the contrary of what you or I might consider success, right? Well, one explanation is systematic errors or biases in our thinking, right? So the belief I'm a failure can snowball over the course of someone's life with a bias called negative filtering. And that would be the person selectively attends to their shortcomings and gives short shrift or dismisses their successes, right? So if I'm in school and I'm getting straight A's, it was an easy test. I was lucky. The curve is low, right? And then selectively attending and magnifying to my perceived shortcomings, not being the best in class, not grading on to law review, that kind of thing. Another important bias that I've already talked about is black and white thinking. If I've only got two categories, success or failure, and nothing in between, it's not possible for me to think I'm a very successful person. I may not be the best, but I'm pretty successful. And black and white thinking underscores many negative core beliefs. Overgeneralization is another bias that we see in core beliefs, right? Rather than I've had successes and failures, when someone believes I'm a failure, it's the totality of who they are, right? It's not a mix of success and failure. So bringing this into the context of perfectionism, a very common belief among perfectionists is I'm not good enough. Right? This is really common. And this belief kicks up feelings of sadness, it can kick up insecurity, feelings of fear. If we go into a context, a job or personal context, believing I'm not good enough, it will affect us emotionally and behaviorally. As an aside, core beliefs can lie dormant and then get activated depending on the situation. So I may be going along just fine at work, and then I'm passed over for a promotion, and my belief I'm not good enough gets activated. Okay. And these beliefs can lead to self-imposed limitations, right, in terms of pursuing goals. So they're important to, it's important to have techniques to challenge it. So I want to walk you through some of those now. So the first is, given that it reflects an overgeneralization, I'm not good enough, right? It may be true that I'm not good enough in certain contexts, and also true in others, right? So the first step is to ask yourself or ask your client, good enough for what, right? I always tell people I may not be good enough to join the US Olympic ski team, but I'm good enough to navigate most trails when I ski, right? So what am I really saying, right? If you're using this technique with yourself. Then the second is, here come the criteria again. What are the criteria for being good enough? So it's not a moving target. I'll know it when I feel it, or I'll know it if I do it. So what constitutes good enough? And spelling that out. And I love this question because it forces clients to become more specific about their beliefs, and we're making things explicit. We're chipping away at generalization. All right. So if I say, I'm not good enough to join the tennis team, just thinking of kids that I work with, I want them to spell out what good enough for the tennis team means. There's probably actual qualifying criteria. And then they know what to do if they want to improve their performance. But in the course of doing this, may also realize, I don't actually want to be on the tennis team. This is kind of irrelevant. Like, my game is good enough for a social game. And that's fine with friends, right? So to summarize there, I often say the belief I'm not good enough is void for vagueness, to borrow from the law. If it were in a contract, you would strike it because it has no inherent meaning. So defining good enough for what, bringing it into a context, making it contextual, chips away at the overgeneralization, and then defining those criteria, okay? And another technique we could use, which is a standard in CBT, is looking at evidence for and against. We call that the two-column technique. It's like drawing a T, labeling the column for and against, and looking at the evidence. But you can't do that until you define what good enough is. Otherwise, you're evaluating essentially nothing, right? I don't know if that's me being perfectionistic. I don't think so. I think it's really important to be systematic when we go through this. And I just got some wonderful feedback from a client yesterday who's been using this and has found it very helpful in terms of his belief he's not a good enough parent. And what does that actually mean? And what are the criteria? And where his performance as a parent really falls out, and sort of questioning whether these criteria are realistic or not. So there was benefit in that. So I want to shift gears a little, mindful of time, and talk about conditional beliefs. So if we go back to the CBT model, we have automatic thoughts that pop into our head without deliberate thinking. That's often the initial focus of treatment in CBT. And those will often lead us to our core beliefs, although sometimes clients just say them, or we just know them, right? We don't need to dig. But there is this intermediary level called conditional beliefs. Conditional beliefs are really important. So all the levels of thinking operate in tandem. They all work to strengthen each other. So conditional beliefs take the form of if this, then that, right? Or when this, then that. And they operate to strengthen core beliefs. So in perfectionism, here are some common ones that you may buy into or you may have encountered. When I'm perfect, I'll be happy, right? That's an interesting one. because it has the net effect of postponing happiness, right? And if I haven't defined what perfection is, I've effectively postponed happiness indefinitely, right? So that's important to uncover and really question, right? So I could look at the evidence for and against that. There were times in my life I've been happy, and I certainly haven't been perfect, right? Doing this either for yourself or for your clients, okay? Looking at the evidence for and against. Often there's very little evidence for, and that's important for clients and ourselves to realize as well. These are just unchecked beliefs that we hold. We haven't really examined them. So there's great utility in making them explicit and evaluating them. So we're not operating on autopilot. Another, if I'm not the best, right? If I'm not valedictorian, then I failed. You could see how that conditional belief will strengthen the core belief, I'm not good enough. I was working with someone who was a perfectionist, outstanding educational history, worked in finance. I don't want to give away identifying info. Was a partner in a firm, and his portfolio outperformed the market pretty much every year, and still had this belief, I'm a failure, I'm not a success. And a big contributing factor was perfectionism and his conditional belief. If I'm not the best, then I failed. And as it turns out, someone else had better performance than him, someone in Manhattan. But so he dismissed his own achievement and was not able to build on a sense of accomplishments. Each one, that happened, it was as if it was for the first time. Okay. Shifting gears a little, if we think about the interpersonal consequences of perfection, they can be devastating. If someone believes, if I'm not perfect, people will reject me, right? So you can think about clients, if you're a mental health professional, and I think we do have some mental health professionals in the group this morning, working with people with body dysmorphic disorder, right? And the suffering, right, in the quest to attain physical perfection, and the belief that it's a precondition, often the belief it's a precondition to being loved, certainly self-loved, and acceptance, right? So there's great value in uncovering that and helping people to see they live by that conditional belief, right? And so I'd want to challenge that as well, or at least evaluate it. I was just discussing this yesterday with a client who has body dysmorphic disorder, talking about heterosexual woman. Other women she's intimidated by who she thinks are so perfect in terms of their appearance and everything she imagines that's a consequence of that. And, I asked her to think about the people she loves and holds dear in her life and she enjoys spending time with. And they're not perfect. Right? If we think about who we love, that doesn't usually enter into it for me, for most people. So why are we making it a condition for our own acceptability, lovability, likability, right? That gets at double standard technique if you're a CBT therapist, right? Another exercise is imagining meeting the perfect person. How would you feel? What would your visceral reaction be like? And usually it's not positive, right? I like to give people who struggle with this particular conditional belief, if it's hindering relationships and holding them back interpersonally, to use a mantra or a coaching statement, be present, not perfect. To remember that as you're getting ready to go out on a date or go to a gathering. Or go to work and give a presentation. Just be present, not perfect. We all make mistakes. Right? So I've alluded to some of these, but once you've uncovered them, I like to map it out for clients, or if you're doing this for yourself, mapping it out on paper. Why? Why am I such a stickler for writing everything down? Because there's a perspective shift. When I see it on ink on the page and it's not floating around in my head, where it can seem realistic, I may see it in a different light. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, we can examine the evidence for and against. I would think of people who've loved me despite my imperfections. 4, there may have been rejections based on appearance, but it's important to evaluate the evidence for and against to elicit that from the client if you're working with someone rather than supply it, right? And I mentioned before, interestingly, there's very little evidence in the 4 column for a lot of these beliefs. People just, they're axiomatic. It's just they think it, therefore it is. They haven't really examined their beliefs. We could also test out conditional beliefs. So one of my favorite experiments for clients who believe if I make a mistake, I'll be rejected or some catastrophic consequence is to deliberately make mistakes in low stakes situations. Certainly not where they're placing a job or an academic career at jeopardy. And then to see if anyone even notices. And they're usually surprised most people don't notice. Just to share with you, we have an Instagram account, and the woman who runs our Instagram posted something with a spelling error this week, and it got like 50 likes. And I think it was the only thing you can control is yourself. And she wrote, she omitted the T. The only thing you can control is yourself, right? And most people, I'm assuming, didn't even notice, or if they did, they didn't care. They still liked the post. So there are lots of creative ways you can experiment with this, either yourself or if you're working with clients. Social media is great for that. All right, and I want to move along to assumptions. That's another type of intermediate belief we focus on in CBT. We focus on this category. Part of the process of CBT is uncovering the client's operative assumptions, helping bring those into awareness, and then evaluating them. So we're not just living mindlessly by these assumptions that we may have been socialized to take on. And this, I just find this very interesting as a therapist, rather than just blindly following them. So some of the assumptions to keep an eye out for in perfectionism. First of all, that perfection is desirable, right? That usually blows the minds of most of the perfectionistic people I work with, that not everyone in the world buys into this assumption that perfection is desirable, right? So it's important to make that explicit. Mistakes are unacceptable, etc. You get the idea. And we can see how these assumptions would strengthen the core belief, I'm not good enough. Now, I don't mean to imply that's the only belief that's at play in perfectionism, but it's certainly one of the most common. And given the scope of the webinar today, I just chose to focus on that. If others are coming to mind, you could put it in the chat. But for many people, these assumptions go unchecked, right? And it never occurs to them that some people may find perfection undesirable, feel uncomfortable. I've heard people talk about homes that were done by interior decorators, and it just feels cold to them because it's too perfect, right? Or with reference to mistakes, that people find mistakes opportunities for learning, right? Or failure. We have a whole culture in Silicon Valley that embraces failure, right? Failure is a necessary part of success, right? And this may really fly in the face of your assumptions or your client's assumptions, right? So to summarize, the technique here is to really just make these assumptions explicit and then evaluate the evidence for and against them. Okay. Could also do the advantages and disadvantages of holding these assumptions. So all of these techniques are designed to chip away at this belief I'm not good enough, to help someone struggling with perfectionism increase self-satisfaction, right? and enable them to use perfection to their advantage rather than their disadvantage. And we have time for questions. So I want to open this up if you want to use the chat box. Let's see, are there any questions or comments or any other points you'd like me to address? I can unmute people. Let's see, can I unmute everybody? All right, so you're gonna have to unmute yourselves. I don't have control over that if you wanna ask me anything. All right, well, it doesn't seem like anyone has any questions. Oh, you do, okay. Ask to unmute. So I have to ask you for permission to unmute you.
Okay, yeah.
There you go. Okay, great.
I was going to type, but it took me too long. I see perfectionism in my children functioning as a way to quickly cover what might really be making something unhappy. Easier to just say, I'm unhappy because it got a D, or than to say very more difficult feelings came up. Sort of, I'm just not perfect, and that's and it's a shield. It's a shield, and you can't answer it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think
it is perfect in another way. They're perfectly to you, but that's how to cut through to, yeah, what do you really mean?
Okay, so your children are perfect to you, but you're observing.
I'm observing them taking standards of perfectionism, like in New York City, I'm perfect because I get A+. That makes me perfect.
Right.
So when they feel bad about something that happened, they'll say it's because I got a 92.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's not perfect. It's not 100, and a friend may have gotten an A+, right?
What hurts is that friend was not kind at lunch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think this could be very helpful to head this off at the pass with kids, particularly in the rigorous private school and public school system in New York City and around the country, where kids become severely depressed if they're not performing based. They're not excelling in comparison to a standard they haven't fully even spelled out, right? We have a couple of kids in the practice right now who are very concerned about how they're perceived and their academic performance, but they're not taking a lot of satisfaction from their achievements, which is interesting because they all are doing really, really well, right? So what's interfering with that? And it's probably perfectionism. Like, I could be excellent, but maybe I'm not number one in my class, right? It doesn't mean like all bets are off for me, right?
Except that when you're number one, then people are even meaner.
Yeah, that brings its own set of problems. Yeah, it can be a no-win depending on how we set it up.
In that particular system, it's a tough one.
Yeah, it's a very tough one. So why add all this unnecessary pressure? And I guess I was also wondering, as you were listening to this idea of applying perfectionism selectively, like reserving it, so if I'm doing an extracurricular for fun, right? Whether it's soccer or ballet, like of course I want to be good, but do I really need to be perfect, whatever that means, right? So I can really enjoy the activity. And I think as adults, not modeling perfectionism, there's value in knowing whether we buy into a lot of this perfectionism, the negative aspects of it.
Mhm.
And are we modeling this for our kids? So if someone brings home a 97 and we say, what happened to the 3 points, right? We're modeling that, right? So to be mindful of that is important. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Uh, Anybody else have a comment or a thought? Looks like we have clinicians who've signed up. Curious to know how you guys work with perfectionism. If you find this a common presenting problem in your practices, if you want to unmute yourselves or not. All right. Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining this morning. Feel free to reach out to us if you have follow-up questions. We'll be posting this webinar on our YouTube channel and excerpts of it to social media, but feel free to reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Lana. Thanks for coming. And yeah, thanks guys. This was fun. Have a great day. Bye.